Okay, after we came back from lunch, we were cross-examining Agent, what was his name?
Stover.
Stover?
Rand Stover.
Rand Stover. And the first thing they were asked was political pressure part of the reason that you did not complete the contracts with the cattle house to sell the cattle and with the contract cowboys? And that was a yes. They brought in a lot more information with the Dave Bundy video. They identified Jason Cox as the person talking to Ryan Bundy in the video, that there was no... Ryan didn't have any firearms in the van. He complied and he was not arrested. Also, Dave did not have any firearms and he was arrested with an iPad. And asked if there was other evidence from Dave Bundy, and he said 3 phones, an ID, an iPad, and a folder. And then they talked about a meeting when he then gave that property back. They started to talk about what situation you would arrest a person and then keep the property that they were arrested with instead of actually giving that property to the arresting authority. And that was objected to, and we never got the answer.
Because the BLM agents were the ones that actually had all of his property.
Right,
Absolutely.
that agent that's a witness in there. And they did show the snipers on the hill when they were arresting Dave Bundy and asked who they were under, and at one point they were under this witness.
They talked about the meeting on the morning of April 9th when Dave got his property back, and that he was roughed up, but they couldn't go into that anymore. Then they went into the video of Ammon being tased, and came out with the names of quite a few, pretty much all of the people in those videos. They talked about, they wanted to point out a point in the video where Ammon kicked a dog in the head. And the agent on the stand says, well, yeah, he kicked the dog in the head, or Mike Carpenter had the dog attack the Ammon after he kicked the dog in the head. We watched the video 2 more times after that, and he recanted his statement. So once again, we're showing conflicting statements just in the room while he's there. So I thought that went really well. They also brought up the fact that, yes, the ICP increased assessment. The people were working on limited sleep to no sleep and limited food to no food during the day of April 12th.
And all they got was a taco truck.
A
Yes.
chocolate truck, yeah.
So are they
All
mad
that.
that the
Poor
Bundys
babies.
didn't feed them?
It would have been nicer. They would have got some Bundy beef.
I would have been happier.
They also brought up the fact that there was no attack on the compound prior to the April 12th. I guess there was a time when they believed that there was going to be an attack on the compound. They got some information, and that attack didn't happen, and it was brought into the fact that maybe their information that they were getting was bad information. That was also objected to, and it stopped right there. We have Todd Engel come in, and he immediately asked, because we all love Todd, he comes in and says, was Dan Lub your supervisor? Obviously, yes, he was. Was any of the officers hurt in this? No, nobody was ever hurt. Not in any of the times of when Ammon was being tased, when Dave, any of the times, not even on the 12th. They also brought up, was anyone tried to actually climb over the fence or get into the compound? No, that did not happen. They also pulled up the video of Ammon being tased, and they were able to circle an officer in that and state that he was holding a Colt AR-15 rifle. And this is prior to the 12th, so it's kind of showing their militarization much earlier than they are trying to let on. Let's see, anything you guys got?
They talked about the First Amendment areas, about when they were set up and who set them up, and if the First Amendment areas were, if the under the bridge was closed due to the First Amendment area, and he said no, so stating that they could be down there.
I think he said under the bridge was, but the people standing on I-15. I-15 was not part of the closure, so basically anyone standing on I-15 was not actually in the closure. and that anyone at the Bundy Ranch was not in the closure.
But the closure was 540,000
acres.
acres.
Todd made a comment about the camouflage, and he said the agent said the reason we wore them is we didn't want to affect the cattle. And so then Todd asked, well, did the contract cowboys wear camo? And he said no.
Yeah.
And they also did not get hurt by the cattle.
Uh-huh.
And they brought up that no one was hurt by the cattle. And then he began to bring up were cattle put down, euthanized during this operation? And yes, 2 bulls were euthanized. And he said, you know,
was he aware of it? And he said, yes, I was aware of it.
and then he asked if there was other cattle being put down in the field. And then this was also objected upon.
Right.
And we didn't get to go much further into this, but you could tell that people were seeing where they were going with these things.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that question had to be withdrawn. And then he said, were you aware being killed? And he said, yes. Some euthanized, some killed. And then they started talking about the Park Service stack formation, whether it be in a defensive move or an offensive move. And they got into the...
That was objected upon as well.
But they got into when the stack formation, when you're trained in law enforcement, is it usually when you're going to issue a warrant or if you're going into a building? And how is that a defensive move? Because you're moving forward, you're not in a defensive mood. So that kind of shot the whole stack formation on us.
At the end of his, he also asked if any of the protesters, and you know, they're say protesters, and they stopped Todd and they said, this is not considered a protest. They stopped him in the courtroom from using the word protesters because they are not seeing us as protesters. They're seeing us as unlawful something. They're not an unlawful crowd, anti-government
Right,
crowd.
yeah,
So you can't even say the word protesters. You have to say the crowd. Now, did the crowd ever throw anything on you from the southbound bridge? And they said no. And because he brought that up, the southbound bridge a lot, and he said, you know, if I was trying to, with a gun, trying to like get a superior advance on you, would I use the northbound or the southbound bridge? And he said, well, you'd use the southbound bridge. So pretty much they're breaking down the entire narrative they have on the inside. And then they were also counting vehicles. Todd made a circle and he said, can you tell me how many vehicles are in that? He said about 37. He said, well, say you had 37 BLM agents, say most of those vehicles were BLMs, and you had 37, that would mean there was 37 AR-15s on that side alone. And
all
then,
BLM officers are issued AR-15s.
Yes.
and then he added another circle which brought it up to 50. And our side, our cars in the circle was like 60. So, you know, they're saying that, oh, you guys had guns and you had more people. But if you like looked at it, the gun ratio was probably heavier on their side.
Absolutely.
And then they said the government never told anyone that they had to protest from the First Amendment area. That First Amendment area was just a suggestion.
Suggested for their safety.
But it was not
hilarious.
appropriate for them to go to the compound and protest there. That was not appropriate.
My favorite part of Todd's whole questioning is sir, did you take an oath to the Constitution, which was immediately objected to and sustained?
What happened?
Todd asked, sir, have you taken an oath to the Constitution?
They objected.
They objected immediately.
Within seconds.
Argumentative. That's an argumentative
So
statement.
after that, he said, so what you're saying is the First Amendment area is only set up for looks? And he responded, that's not what I said. But he was talking about his training, and they asked him if he ever, on a criminal, if they ever do any investigation to find out if they have criminal backgrounds, if they did that on the Bundys, and at one point he said no, and then later on another, I forget who it was, had asked him if they had done any investigations, and he had said yes. So...
Yeah, he worked for the Secret Service as well as the BLM before he went to the BLM.
Then we had Jackson come up, and he asked if there was a general policy for protest for the BLM. And he said, no, there is no documentation of what was a lawful and unlawful protest. And he said, so does this mean you just kind of make up your mind case by case? I think that was objected to, and we had to move on. Then it was Agent Love your superior? That was again yes. Who was higher up than Agent Love? They did say that there was someone on the ground that was higher up than Agent Love that was there.
They didn't name him?
No, they did not name him. Then they talked about the April 11th, how they decided they were going to be done with operations. And they had a big argument over what done with operations meant. And the agent on the stand said, you know, he made it seem like they were still going to take the cattle in the cages, but they weren't going to round up any more cattle. And he said, as I quote, personally, I wanted to finish loading up the 377 trespassing cattle and remove them from the land. He said personally, he wanted to. And I believe that goes to show that, you know, when law enforcement came and told them to back up, he personally didn't want to do it.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yep.
And then Todd Leventhal came on at the very end and asked if the BLM put videos out to counter the videos that were put out by the Bundys, because the videos that were put out by the Bundys were put out and made to grab the heartstrings. Like some of the dead cattle were, you know, for animal rights activists, and some of the First Amendment ones are for anti-government extremists, and I'm just quoting.
Yeah.
And they said no, they did not put out any videos to try to counter that. Then they talked about a list of people, a running log, as he says, of people that they use undercover agents in many anti-government extremist groups that were adding names to this running log of people that were added to the threat assessment. So now they didn't really go in a lot to this. This was moved on real quickly. But from what it sounds like people's names that maybe thought of coming or weren't even coming, people's names that were put on this list from such organizations like 3% or Oath Keepers or anything like that. So it sounds like they did have undercover agents trying to grab information, but he wasn't the investigational agent, so he couldn't comment on that. And then he asked, what was your direct relationship with Dan Love? And was he your direct supervisor? Yes, and you know, do you follow his orders? Obviously. If you saw Dan Love do something illegal, would you file a report on it? And he said yes. And then he said, if you saw Dan Love do something unethical, would you report on it? And there was a silence for a while. And then he said, well, can you explain unethical? And, you know, they did a little something. And then he said, I'd like to think I would. And then he went to continue saying something else. And Myrie was like, objection. I can't remember what he objected to, but he wouldn't let whatever was going to get out of that guy's mouth out of his mouth. And then we took a break.
Wow.
So hopefully we'll go back in and find out what he was about to say.
Good
He
reporting.
said, I've been made aware.
Yeah.
I've been made aware of that.
Stopped him.
And that's when they stopped him. And I went like this.
We don't know what